It's interesting because I work a lot with engineers, especially at the commercial level of theater, and I interface with them a lot. And I found through my career that ultimately, and my students ask me all the time, how do I know if something's going to stand up? And I say, if it looks like it's going to stand up, it usually does. Interesting. So I'm going to talk today about specifically about the theatrical design process, but this also applies to a lot of other avenues of design. And I've recently forayed into theme design and museum design, and these types of techniques that I'm going to be talking about they're appropriate for all different avenues. So, okay, so as a designer, you really, students come in a lot and they say, listen, I'm really stuck, I don't know what to do. And I tell them, you can't be stuck. It's not, you will be fired if you get stuck. And I say, listen, if you just smash a light bulb into a model box on the way to class, at least we can have a conversation about shattered glass and how it relates to the play. So doing something is really important. This is very, very true. If you do something, I guarantee that those bad ideas will lead to good ideas. In fact, some of my most successful designs have the impetus for that were just awful. But you need to start somewhere because you need to have a conversation about something visual. This is another. I think this is really philosophically really important for any designer. Is that oftentimes, because you're kind of floating in this giant ocean of nothingness, when you finally get a fragment of something that floats, you grab onto it with all of your heart and you don't let go of it. And I think it's really important that if you do have an idea, that idea may be great, but it might be great for another project. If you spend a month on an idea that you discard, that is not wasted time. Knowing what something isn't is as important as knowing what it is. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in my studio and I've hammered away at an idea that turned out to be the wrong idea, but it really informed what the next idea was. As artists, designers, we need to be comfortable being in a state of not knowing. And I know, as a theater designer, the ultimate result is the opening night performance. And until that point, you really don't know exactly what this is going to be. So it's very, very important that you be comfortable being ignorant about what that final design is going to be. And it took me a long time to realize this and to understand how important this frame of mind was. Okay, so how do we jumpstart the design process? And again, this relates to theater design. It also relates to engineering, industrial design, or whatever. So the first thing that I do as a designer is I do research. And I look at photographers, painters, performers, artists, and ultimately the real world. I bring my own experiences into the process. And I think that, oftentimes people will say to me, it's like, where should I go to study theater as an undergrad? And I say, you shouldn't go to undergrad to study theater. You should go to undergrad to kind of fill up your toolbox. You should get a really strong liberal arts degree because as a designer, you're going to bring to bear your knowledge of art, your knowledge of history, your knowledge of theology. Those are the things that are the most important. Learning how to build models, learning how to draw, those are very secondary to learning how to talk. I also really insist that students hit the library. I think that we spend, going up to Google and typing set design for Marriage of Figaro, that's really not exhaustive research. So I found in my personal experience that books are generally very more scholarly than the internet. Anybody can put things on the internet. It takes years of discipline to write a book. And just to prove my point, I went on the internet and typed in Mona Lisa and I got 8 different paintings. So read critical essays, biographies, etc. I often do a lot of reading as I start to read about the playwright, to read about the period. I watch a lot of films. You'll see there'll be some references to Terry Gilliam and some other film artists in this talk. Sometimes I just start drawing. I'll just take a piece of paper and I'll just start sketching a space. And sometimes that kind of unlocks ideas. Sometimes it's really important that if you really don't know what the big picture is, to just support the action of what's happening in the play. In this particular scene, they're sitting at a kitchen table, and there's a refrigerator. So why don't you in an empty space, put a table, some chairs, and a refrigerator, and start with that. And sometimes that helps you to solve the big picture. I also think it's really, really crucial that if you're going to generate an abstract space for a design, that you really invest in understanding what the real world looked like. So even though the space is abstract, the characters in that play are obeying certain rules of the real world. And there's also something to be said too for when you walk in, if you see a design should really look like it's inhabited by the characters that exist in that story, even though the space isn't real. Collaboration, talk to your team. Sometimes that unlocks a lot of ideas when you just start talking to other people about the project. I remember when I was in grad school, I was working on a project and it just wasn't working. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I got these giant pieces of brown craft paper and I grabbed a charcoal and I just started drawing. And it was something I wasn't familiar with, and that unlocked a lot of ideas. And there's something to be said too, but sometimes in drawing class when it's not going well, switch hands. Brain dump, I find that just writing thoughts about my design before I begin really helps. And then I find getting on an exercise bike is more helpful than anything. Okay, so this is one of my first designs. Do we want to lower the lights a little bit more, or is this just a little bit? Because some of these images are a little dark. So I designed a production of Hamlet when I was in grad school, and it was the conceit was that there were two actors that played Hamlet. One of them was a white man, and then there was a black woman also playing Hamlet, and they switched off from night to night. And I was my first project, and I was really invested in it, and I wanted to do something completely amazing, and I didn't know what to do. I was completely stuck. So I found this. We set it in Edwardian England, and I found this picture of this Edwardian dining room. So I built this model of this Edwardian dining room, and I brought it to the director. And he looked at this model that I had presented, and he took a little person, and he stuck it up on top of the ceiling. And he said, you know what if we did the ghost scene in the first act, scene 1, act 1, right on top of that ceiling? And I thought, wow, so here's something to be said for an analog process, where you bring in a piece of sculpture that's really not formed, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, what if we did this? What if we put a person on top? And then we thought, well, what if we broke the walls apart as Hamlet's illusion starts to erode? What if the world around him starts to erode? And I thought, wow, this is a way that we use models, and we use this piece of sculpture that's kinetic, that's constantly moving, that's constantly in process to create the design. And I think that I'm going to really stress throughout this talk that keeping a process that's in flux, I think, is really important. First of all, it engages other people in your process, and it also it allows you not to marry an idea too quickly. This design was not successful at all, but the process of it was very. I think for me it was an eye-opener. And so we covered the walls with red velour, and the first scene we lit from the table, and it was this very, very huge idea. It was quite beautiful, beautifully lit, but I think that the design overwhelmed the story. And at one point I brought the ceiling all the way to right above the actor's head, and when this poor person is trying to recite to be or not to be, and this giant, massive ceiling is floating down, no one cares what this person's talking about. Okay, sometimes when you're working on a project, you find the ultimate piece of research. And this is a painting by Anselm Kiefer, who's a German sculptor and painter. And so I did Seagull with Bob Falls down at the Goodman Theater. And we spent a lot of time looking at 19th century Russian estates. And at first we wanted to do it very realistically. But ultimately, sometimes when you do Chekhov in a realistic space, it feels like a museum piece. It feels very much like it's behind glass. So we thought, well, what if we took all the textures of the farm, all the textures of this rural landscape, and we created an abstract piece of art. And that's why I loved this painting. So what I did was I took that painting and I made my own version of that painting using, again, natural elements from the Russian farmland. And so we used that as the impetus for our final design, which was this. And what we did was we told all the actors that we were going to do this as a very realistic piece. And so they expected there to be a real room, and then we didn't give them a real room. And it was, I thought, ultimately a very successful process because it was very simple. It was trimmed down to what was really essential, and then we had this kind of wonderful abstract painting that gave a sense of the landscape without being naturalistic. And that's the photograph. So sometimes I just draw, and I do these really crappy little sketches, but they're to scale, and I'm just exploring space. And this is a production I'm doing of the new Christmas Carol down at the Alliance Theater in Atlanta. It's still very much in process. So I start with these very, very rough drawings, and I don't show them to anybody. But for me, they're important because I can actually I start to understand what the space is. I understand ultimately people in the space, and then I do another kind of less crude drawing, sometimes at my drafting table. And so this was the next stage in the process. And then from there, I do these very, very, very rough models that are on paper. So what I'll do is I'll draw the entire. It's rough in that it's not. There's no color. It's not. Everything's just drawn. So, and then so here's a. So this is a my assistant's giant hand spinning this little. But what I like about it is that if you look, things are not all completely realized. There's still, someone can, if the director said to me, I wish the bed was somewhere else, we just rip it out of there and move it somewhere else. So it's a constantly evolving piece of sculpture. And I often find too, I'm going to talk a lot about the analog versus digital, and I found, especially with young designers in the theater, that computer-aided design is a wonderful way to document an idea, but sometimes exploring with a pencil is actually more, it's a better way to explore the idea. I do a lot of these napkin sketches, and I met with a director. This was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Looking Glass, and I did this on a napkin, and I said, like, well, what if we did this iris, and that was the Nautilus and all this. So this is where I started with the director with these really, really rough drawings. And this is a scene from Terry Gilliam film, and I thought, well, what if we did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, not naturalistically, but what if we did this like this little toy theater piece where there were a lot of the scenes happened in this little frame, and we used puppets, and finding a way to abstract it. And then I saw this image, and I was like, wow, that, there's a lot of circus, especially at Looking Glass. They incorporate a lot of circus performance into their productions, and I thought, well, this looks like it's underwater, but there's still these rings, and maybe, it could really accommodate physical performance. And then I did this model, again, a rough sculptural model of what that could be, and I thought, well, what if there was a little toy theater frame, but it was the transom of a ship, and these were all these elements that Captain Nemo had collected from all the ships that he had sunk. And then this is the photographs of the final design. Finding ways to abstract. These performers were in a boat. We had this platform that came out of the floor to become the top of the Nautilus, and there was a ladder that they could climb down into and get inside the submarine. This is when they were on top of the sub, and the sub starts to dive, and they almost fall off. And again, there was a lot of circus performance incorporated into it. And then that platform could become a table. That platform could become the map in the war room. So finding versatile ways to reuse design elements. Sometimes you just have a big idea, and it's like, let's just try it. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's worth exploring. And I think it's really important to leave a lot of time in your design process so you can go down an avenue that doesn't work and then come back and go somewhere else. So our idea was like, what if there's this massive skylight that could accommodate all the different scenes? And this was a model. Like, it could become the wall of the print shop. It could become the ceiling of the meeting house. And it could also become the skylight in the apartment. So this was an idea that I'm not sure it completely worked, but we just went for it. And it was a very, very bold gesture. sometimes when you come up with these bold gestures, they seem to sometimes overwhelm the story. And I think there were times where I thought that the design overwhelmed the story a little bit. So this was a finished model. I don't often do these very, very finished models. This was a production of Virginia Woolf on Broadway. And the director said to me, sometimes there's an idea. Like Star Wars, the idea was cowboys in space. And if you can come up with this one idea and just run with it, sometimes it really, really works well. And her idea was like, I really want this space to be really dark. I think George is sinister, and I want the space to feel like a Hitchcock movie. So that was my impetus for creating this space. And then, of course, George is trying to make the space his own, so there's books all over. And sometimes you just find the perfect interior space. And this is a photographer named Robert Povolodori, and he does this beautiful book called Havana, and it's all these kind of decrepit old spaces that are, there's a sense of long past opulence. So we found this room, we were like, this is for Uncle Vanya at the Goodman that Bob Falls directed, and I said, you know what, let's just do it. So I did a very rough, so again, I went to my drafting table and I drew this space up, and I cut it out and I put it on paper and cardboard, and we started to explore this space. And at one point the director said, I just want you to create a ground, what if they can't afford to heat the whole house, so they've moved all of their stuff into this one room. And so we ran with that idea. And this was the ultimate final design. Here's another situation where this was for Wonderful Town at the Goodman. This is a musical directed by Mary Zimmerman. And I found this graphic artist up in Minneapolis. And I just fell in love with it, the graphic quality and the colors and all this stuff. So when I do find an image and I'm going to really steal it, I contact the artist and I find out, listen, can we use this? We'll pay you for it. We'll give you tickets, whatever. And he enthusiastically let us use his design. So again, I went back to the drafting table and I did a really rough white model of this idea where actors could move these buildings around, and things were and clouds would move and little planes, and taxi cabs were skateboards, and it was this whimsical little playground. Here's another white model shot. And then from here, we took my hand drawing and this is the model. And actually, this was the show curtain for the model. We thought it just to be a sketch of the skyline of New York. We got rid of the Statue of Liberty because it seemed like it was putting a hat on a hat. And this was the so I took my assistant took my rough drawings, put them into CAD, and from CAD we generated this more finished model. I don't ever use the word finished model. There's a more finished model because it's never finished. It's never precious. It's a tool in the process. Do some more. And this is the final. This is the actual production. At one point we thought, what if there's a big crate that comes down and spills all the furniture for the scene in the middle of the stage, and that's how we started the scene. This was another toy theater project where I was really inspired by the intimacy and the scale of this little toy theater. So the director, Mary Zimmerman, gave me drawings of what she wanted them to look like. And sometimes directors will give me these very naive drawings, and I find them to be very helpful, because anything I can do, again, to jumpstart that process, to become inspired, and ultimately, I want to give her what she wants. So when they give me drawings, they give me ground plans, anything, I find it to be very, very helpful. And so from this, I did a really rough sketch, and then I did a more refined sketch of what this toy theater frame could look like. And then I drew all the components. And I drew them very quickly, because I want to be able to generate an idea really fast so that if it doesn't work out, I'm not married to it. I haven't spent weeks on it. So, and then from there, I did this rough white model. There's a fish it's called the Steadfast Tin Soldier. It's about a little tin soldier who falls in love with a ballerina. It was done completely with music, and there was no dialogue. And there you go. It was fantastic. Oh, thank you. Excellent. And then I generated this in Photoshop There's an advent calendar scene. There's a curtain where they open up these little windows. And so this was the, I generated this in AutoCAD and then I colored it in Photoshop. And then I do, this is a combination of painting and digital Photoshop work. Sometimes I'd love to just do a hand painting, then I put it into the computer to play with the color and to enhance certain parts of it. Same thing here. And this is the scenes from the actual production. There was a lot of puppetry. And there's that frame. And this was Mary's image of the fish eating the tin soldier, and this was the final image in there. Okay, so sometimes you find an image that inspires you to come up with a design. Sometimes I just think about how the play moves. Like, how does it move? Does it move? Is it rough? Does it move fluidly? Is there a monotony to the movement? So whenever you talk about a design that moves in the theater, it needs to be the way it moves needs to be thematically in keeping with your design conceit. And so this was a Treasure Island that I did with Mary Zimmerman. And we thought, well, what if there was this massive platform that could move like a ship? And this is the drawing. And so this is us in the theater when they first put this in there. So we thought, what if the whole set could move like this? And it was moved by the performers.
Is that sitting on something?
It is sitting on something, but ultimately we wanted it to look like it was hanging, but it wasn't. It was just, there were casters underneath it, just because of the engineering of it. It was just became, those ropes would have to be really, really heavy cables, and it didn't look right. So we put it on rollers. Here's more of the design. And when I was in the theater, I thought the black floor didn't look right, so we painted it this blue-green. So this was a show I did on Broadway with Chris Rock called The Motherfucker with the Hat. It's a Stephen Adly Gurgis play. And when I first met with the director, she said, don't dumb down the design because it's a play about poor people. And I thought, wow, that was great. So what we did was we created this space that had to transform into different locations. And the way it moved, we wanted it to move like street poetry, like it was like a three-card Monte. Like you thought it was going to do this, but I did this. And so we came up with this design that had all this automation in it, where things spun, things came out of the floor, walls appeared. So it basically, the whole space resolved around the performers. I mean, this might be too dark, but I'm going to show you what this transition looked like. And the music was by Terence Blanchard. But so it went like all these different components spun, and it almost looked like it was turning itself inside out. We did this production in different, that's Jimmy Smits over there, and that's John Ortiz. So we did this production in a number of locations. So it resolved. So that was the conceit of the design, was how it moved. Actually, before I go to, this is a production I did of Luna Gale at the Goodman. And we decided to put the whole set on a turntable because this play is about social workers and the mundaneness of their lives. And so that we just had this constant revolving. So we can see, and while this thing is moving, we're still continuing to tell the story. There are scenes that are happening. So she leaves that one scene, and she goes through that door, and then there's another kind of semi-scene happening. So the transitions were really, really important in this production, and that's how we started. We started with it. How would it move? How do we make this space feel like they are living in this world where it's like every single day is exactly the same, and all the spaces are very similar. And then she comes into her office as the set resolves, and then the scene starts. This was a Daniel Handler play that I did out in Berkeley. This was another one where transitions were really crucial. It's called Imaginary Comforts. And he's the Lemony Snicket author. And we wanted the world to be, to again, look like it's turning into itself and unfolding, and then we wanted it to feel confusing. And so we employed two different turntables, so the world really kind of, like this carousel. And I tend to prefer design where we use often very simple elements to tell the story and we distill it down to what's really essential. And here, all we did was we had a kitchen table and we had a refrigerator, and yet we were still able to evoke a sense of the space. This was a production I did out in La Jolla. It was Glengarry Glen Ross. And what we wanted this transition to feel like, again, I was kind of stuck, and it's like, well, I don't. This play happens in these very realistic spaces. How do we find a way to make the design more evocative? So the idea was, this is about real estate. This is about guys trying to sell things. This is like, you thought I was going to do this, but I'm going to do this. And so we wanted the idea for the transition to be that we're in the Chinese restaurant. At the end of the act, we stay in the Chinese restaurant. At the beginning of the second act, lights go down, and then 3 seconds later, lights come up and we're in a completely different space. And I was like, that's the idea. That's the idea I wanted. And then when the director saw the way the set moved, he said, I'm not going to spend all that money on a set and not have the audience see it. So we changed. Yes?
Can you tell me what the range of your budgets is for these? As a stranger, I'm curious as to what you.
Well, the thing is, budgets really don't mean anything. The reason being is that one organization or one shop or one theater can do something for that looks like $1 million for $20,000, and another theater has $1 million and they can't do anything. So it's how they're organized. It's, and also it's the shops that when we send bids to, especially commercial shops, if they're really busy, if they have a lot going on, they're going to charge you, because they don't want to do it. And some shops will be like, I really need the work. I got to keep my employees busy, so they'll give you a deal. So all I can say is, being in this industry for this long, I have no clue what things cost. It's amazing. Like, and on Broadway, when you get like, we have $800,000 for the set. Like when I first went to Broadway, I was like, I can do whatever I want. That's totally the opposite. Because whenever you do anything, it's $100,000, and then when you cut it, it's not worth anything. So if you're $100,000 over budget and you say, I'm going to cut that, well, that's only $500. I'll cut that. It's like just like your car. It's like if you added up the cost of all the parts in your car, it would be a $2 million car. So same in theater. Sure. So this is the Chinese restaurant, again, a white model, and then I had this billboard, this 1970s billboard up above. It takes place in Chicago. And then this was the office. So how do we get from the office to from the Chinese restaurant to the office? So my idea was this, and I'll show you this transition. And actually, that aquarium, we had to do it as a video because the weight of the water would have weighed more than the whole set. So we filmed a fish tank, and the actors throughout the entire rehearsal process thought it was real. They would tap on the glass, and it was. So I'm going to show you what this transition is. And I actually do wish that we could have done it the old way, where it's like lights go out, lights up, we're in the office. What happened to that restaurant? And so he's trying to make a sleazy real estate deal. So the lights go down, and actually, see the top of the fish tank, you'll see the water move. We made the water move as if it looked like it was real. So the whole set goes up in the air, and it revealed so the bottom of the Chinese restaurant became the ceiling of the office. And it was a very small space, and it was very surprising. So, thinking about transitions. I worked with this director named Laszlo Marton, who's a Hungarian director. Sometimes the whole idea of the design is to tame the space. And we did this in this massive theater. And he's like, I want the theater to feel smaller. So we stepped it in, and we created this very small frame within this world. And when I sent him these photos, he sent back an email saying, no, it was a phone call. Yeah, he phoned me and said, I love the design, and I especially love the color. So we painted the whole set this kind of gold and this purples, and sometimes a white model is better. Sometimes you get a model, you do the white model, then you do a finished model, you paint it, and then you just don't like it as much. There's something about it all being the same kind of color that enhances the actors and just makes it feel just more appealing. This was another set. Sometimes I just did this production out in Portland. It was a production called Crossing Minnesota, and it's about Standing Rock and relating, it's about the clash between the Native Americans and the government over Standing Rock. And we wanted the river to be a huge element in this, so we just took this piece of sculpture and I made a model of it, and then we just did it. And we had this river shoot out past the proscenium, and it was over the audience's head, and we used it to evoke the sense of the river. Okay, sometimes you have really, really bad ideas. This is a terrible idea for three sisters, and the idea was that they are on top of their house. So there's a map of the Russian map of Russia back there, and then the house is underneath this plexiglass floor. So when we first talked about it, we thought, wow, that's going to be a really cool idea. It's a terrible idea, and it really had nothing to do with the play, and also that hugely reflective surface would have been a nightmare. So I did a number of versions of this really bad idea. And then ultimately we came to this, where the house was still there, but the house was floating above them, and it's in a frame. And what I've often done too lately is just expose the theater. So we just left the theater open, we didn't mask it at all. And ultimately the reason why I like that is that there's an honesty to it. And oftentimes, again, Chekhov can feel like a museum piece, and we really wanted it to be a more raw experience, so we got rid of it. And these are some of the, you can see just the bare theater back there. But they had real furniture and real clothes, and so sometimes when you design a space that's very abstract, having real furniture really grounds the actors, and it actually allows them to engage with the world. I did this production of Happy Days out in California Shakespeare, and I met with the director, and we talked for a while, and he said, what if this just looked like a big box of sand that spilled? So I went down into the parking lot and I got a bunch of sand, and I made a little paper box, and I spilled it onto the theater, and we stuck her in the top of the mound, and he was like, that's great, let's do that. And then I made a better model, not necessarily better, but more complete model. And then this was the final design. And what was great, that's all styrofoam. This is all just styrofoam. They carved it and painted it and sprinkled some dirt on top of it, but it was beautifully made. Yeah, he was great. But then we just kind of left this raw space, and then we put some elements of it's this woman stuck in a mound. It's a Samuel Beckett Happy Days, and there were all elements of her life in there, like dolls and pieces of furniture and things in the dirt. So this was for a production of Grapes of Wrath I did on Broadway, and I was doing a production out at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I looked out my window one day, and down right there, you see this little crack of sky, and I thought, wow, that's really beautiful. And so that was the impetus for the first scene of it. This was with James Franco and Chris O'Dowd. And I do these very, very rough drawings. Again, I don't show anybody. They're just to explore space. And I thought, well, what if the barn was just a giant pile of moldy hay? And what if the barn also had a hanging old harvester just hanging there, dripping oil? And then down right, you can see that that's an image of a barn. I thought, wow. So this was the white model that I did, and I explored this crack idea where I just layered the photograph I took right on top of this image of the model. And then we thought, well, what if the barn looks like a cross between a barn and an insane asylum? And when we bid this out to the scene shop in New York, this piece alone was like $250,000, so we cut it, which often happens too. And I thought, well, what if it's just a big moldy pile of hay for the barn? Here's another white model image. And this is the final, or the more finished model of that. And that was the ultimate barn scene, because my giant harvester idea was too expensive. There's some more images that show. I worked a number of years for the Big Apple Circus, and we talked and talked. The director and I had lengthy conversations, and we said, most often the bandstand, the band structure that the performers come through is often very architectural. And the director said, well, what if we made it look like a Tiffany lamp? So I found this image of this Tiffany lamp, and then we went into, then we drew this in Illustrator. We thought, well, this very organic Art Nouveau set. And this was the model that I did. And this was the final space. This was the New York Times photo. Sometimes, when you're working in the theater, there's a play that has one very, very specific problem that you have to solve. And this is Clean House. This is Sarah Rule play. And there's a scene in the play where all of a sudden they are on a balcony by the ocean and they start throwing apples into the apartment or into the house. So in the previous versions of this, that balcony was up above, the balcony was in the back, and we thought, is there a way we can get that balcony right in the middle of that room? So the idea was that there's a skylight, and the skylight came down and became the balcony. So that was how we solved that problem. So the whole design materialized after we discovered how to solve that one specific problem in the play. This is a production of Little Foxes at the Goodman. And for me, we had one idea of the play where there's this young woman named Birdie who's very, very cruelly treated by her husband and her brothers. And so we wanted this sense of animal cruelty in the space, and we decided to go down the road of a kind of a Grimm's fairy tale. But for me, ultimately, this was all about ground plan. Like, where do these people sit? There's a piano, there's a table. So when I started this, I had no idea what the envelope was going to be. I just drew that ground plan, and I started putting furniture in the space. And then I went to my drafting table and I drew this room. And then this was the final design. And I also find too, sometimes a soaring space can feel very intimate. And in the back room, we had a scene of a fox hunt painted on the wall. There's still companies that produce this Victorian wallpaper, which is really beautiful stuff. This was a production of Red that I did at the Goodman, and I also did it down in Washington. And it's about Mark Rothko and him generating the paintings for the Seagram building in New York, which actually never materialized because he had a disagreement. But my idea was that there's something about his paintings, the box within the box, within the box, within the box, and that's how the idea for the design emerged. So the idea of the box, within the box, within the box, and the final box was the painting. So this was a production of Crucible I did at Steppenwolf, and we started with very realistic 17th century interiors. And I remember Martha Levy, the late Martha Levy, who was artistic director of the Steppenwolf, she called me after I submitted the original design. She said, this play is about really big ideas. I think the space for this play should be a bigger vessel. And that just opened up my eyes. And so we did this soaring space of wood that all the scenes happened within that one space. It was just we threw hay on the floor for the prison, and it was just simply done. But they were always. So this was August Osage County that I did, and these are some of the rough models. So in the initial idea, so sometimes you don't know what the idea is. The idea emerges out of your process. So we started with a very realistic house because the playwright wanted a real house on stage, and we were hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. So what I did was I took that real house, we built the real house, we stuck it in, I started ripping it apart. And as I ripped it apart, I found it was like, wow, it's just this sigh of relief. I mean, it was like this, started as a very heavy home, and all of a sudden it started to turn into this skeletal Gothic dollhouse, which was such a better image for the play. So that's how it evolved, purely out of trying to get it down to budget. I also find in my career that when you're over budget and you start trimming things away to get to budget, the design becomes better, becomes clearer, it becomes simpler. You start to prioritize what's really important, and after a while it becomes an image as opposed to something absolutely heavy and real. And it's more about the performers. And in this case, it was hugely beneficial that we started to tear it apart. That's the model. We did something that not a lot of people were happy about. We thought, let's stage this like you're looking into a window at these people. So oftentimes when you see people at a table at a theater, they're only on 3 sides. And then there's no chair down here because it blocks. So we said, who cares? Let's just put them all around the table and people see what they see. This is our youth. This was the first production that we did. This one moved to Broadway as well. This was, we did it as a very small scale version at Steppenwolf first. And then we moved it to New York. And then when we moved it to New York, my idea was, I walked around the Upper West Side a lot with the playwright Kenny Lonergan, and it's like we wanted this space to feel like that the city was like outer space, like the city was huge and vast and imposing, and they were in this small little box. And so we generated this my assistants and I generated this white model. And again, we can generate these models in like a morning. We usually have furniture around the studio, and we crank out an idea really quickly just to see what it means. And this was the more finished model. And what we also found too, that when we did that city portion, when we did it very realistically, it detracted from what happened on the inside. So the producer Scott Rudin, who's a tough guy, he said, "I hate it. It's awful." So what I did was I painted that background a bone white color, and then he really liked it because then it became kind of abstract, and it focused on that central space, and it also took color really well. This was during the rehearsal. And my idea was I wanted those buildings to go all the way up to the grid. Like you could never see the end of them, but we couldn't afford it, so we had to create a capped piece up there. So I was bummed about that. Should we take questions? Yeah, okay, cool. Huh? Okay, we take questions. I just want to talk a little bit about CAD versus hand drawing. So up until recently, I did all my drawings by hand. And I do find that I can explore ideas better by hand. I find that there's a certain gesture to them that really shows my intention, and also the line weights are infinite. But we can end on this and take some questions. Yeah, very well.